Welcome, everybody. I'm Rabbi Jill Jacobs. I'm the executive director of Truah, which mobilizes a network of more than 2,000 rabbis to be a moral voice on both Israel and the occupied territories and on North America. And I want to just first of all thank Logan, who's wandering around somewhere in the back wave, who organized this panel, and the whole J Street staff for what's already a fantastic start to this conference. Really, I can't say I'm excited to be here talking about anti-Semitism. I don't think that if you had asked me 5 years ago whether I would be spending so much time talking about anti-Semitism, I think I just would have told you that you were crazy, but here we are in this political moment. And today, of course, poignantly, a year after the terrorist attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, it's a very appropriate time, unfortunately, to be here talking both about anti-Semitism and also the way in which it's been politicized and weaponized by some parts of the political spectrum. I am excited to have a fantastic group of panelists here today. I'm just going to give your first line bios, if that's okay, and you all should go in your program book or on the app and you can read their whole bios. So I'll go sitting to my left, though only physically. We can argue about Eric Ward is a national expert on the relationship between hate violence and preserving democratic institutions, governance, and inclusive societies. He brings nearly 30 years of expertise in community organizing and philanthropy to his role as the executive director of the Western State Center. And then sitting next to Eric is Maya Berry, the executive director of the Arab American Institute, who steers the Institute's policy agenda and also has a long history of working in DC, including in the House. And Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, is a contributor to a number of publications and to CNN, as well as the author of 3 books. And Haley Soifer is a seasoned congressional aide, an Obama administration alumna, and a foreign policy expert, and now is the first executive director of the Jewish Democratic Council of America. So welcome, thank you for being here. Let's start with your personal experience with anti-Semitism. I'm curious to hear if all of you have had personal experience in any way, and related to that, why does anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism matter to you? So should we just start with Eric and go that way for now?
Okay, we'll go quick. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. This is a good question. I've had lots of experiences with anti-Semitism. Of course, some have been more overt and some more subtle. The first that I remember was on the campus of the University of Oregon in the 80s and doing some work across student clubs. And we brought in the Jewish Student Union as part of this kind of configuration of organizations working on the curriculum on campus. And I remember one of the students relating to me that just the year before, she was Jewish, and that her roommate asked her if she could see her tail, right? Now, this is not the 40s, right? This is the late 80s in Eugene, Oregon, right? One of a progressive campus. And it really reinforced for me at a time we were organizing against the white nationalist movement in the Pacific Northwest, which was driven by anti-Semitism, that these groups weren't simply creating anti-Semitism out of the air, that they were tapping into something that already existed within the mainstream.
I'll answer the second question first, which is I think anybody that cares about humanity and justice and being able to exist fully as who we are as human beings has to combat anti-Semitism, care about it. Thankfully, my experience with it is quite limited. It's something that I've read a great deal about in relation to history. And I trust what will come out during our discussion, it's also something I've been accused of. So that'll be an interesting part of the conversation.
I've been accused of it too. I think the most memorable experience I had of anti-Semitism was I was a graduate student. I was traveling with a friend through Eastern Europe, and we ended up in Lithuania and Latvia, which was significant to me because my parents are South African. The vast majority of South African Jews come from Lithuania, Latvia. And we were at this kind of outdoor beer hall. They drink beer really early in the morning in Latvia, I realized. And we were seated next to these people, and it turned out they were Swedish construction workers. I know it sounds like a porn movie, but they actually really were Swedish construction workers, at least they said so. And so not really knowing exactly what topics to strike up with these guys, you know, I turned to the guy next to me and said, well, how do you like Latvia? You know, it seemed like the obvious thing to ask him. And he turned to me and he said, it's a great country. And then he paused and he said, you know, it was the first country to be Judenfrei, right, to be free of Jews. And it was funny because my friend was sitting on the other side of the table with these the rest of the Swedish construction workers. And so I started in a kind of very Woody Allen-esque scene. I started to kind of like try to get his attention, you know, like maybe finish up, you know, we can start on the tour. But he was having a great time. Maybe they were not genocidal anti-Semites. I don't know. But, you know, it did, you know, I think back to it sometimes because it was such a bewildering experience. And I think it maybe gave me a little bit of a tiny sense of how disempowering experiences of anti-Semitism are. Because it's the kind of thing where, like, you imagine your whole life that in a moment like that, given the weight of Jewish history, you will, you know, act in this heroic way. You know, you will turn over the table and stand up and say, never again in this soil. But in fact, like, you look like a schmuck. Like, what am I supposed to do? Right? Like, you know. And so, in a way, like, I think that, you know, that was a powerful memory of it being disempowered. And it made me think, it was, to me, I thought, you know, about the irony of this happening there, you know, and for me, anti-Semitism, look, I mean, obviously anti-Semitism matters because all bigotry matters, but anti-Semitism matters particularly to me because this is my people, right? And being there in Latvia, you know, my family didn't just immigrate once, they kept getting it wrong. So they had to immigrate from place to place to place, right, before they could finally make it to the United States, from Lithuania to South Africa, Congo to Egypt, and so there was this sense of fragility that I saw with my older relatives in my family, the fragility of being in lots of different countries, none of which you felt totally secure in. And so for me, anti-Semitism connects to that feeling of deep fragility. And that was part of what made me in an early age a Zionist, was being able to see that what gave my relatives a sense of security, no matter where they were, was the idea that there was one state which was for them.
Well, I feel lucky in that until very recently I hadn't experienced it personally. But like so many of you, I've noticed changes that I feel have affected me personally as I enter my synagogue. So in the past few years, as we have had to deal with security and security guards we've never seen before at our synagogue, and then in my synagogue, which happens to be in the middle of our nation's capital here, going through metal detectors, not just for the high holidays, but when I take my children to Sunday school, and then even at the high holidays this year, actually having to take off my shoes, feeling as if it were going through TSA, and recognizing that that is because this threat is so serious, and it is so severe as it relates to our places of worship, which I think is particularly appropriate today as we honor 1 year since the horrific attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And I will say on a personal note, though, being in this role, serving as the head of a Jewish democratic organization, and even speaking here, the virulent and vitriolic hatred that we see online, including those directed perhaps at many of us up here, but I can speak for myself, including coming from Jews, is particularly disconcerting, and yes, in some cases, is definitely anti-Semitic.
Thank you so much. As you all know, anti-Semitism originated in the first centuries of the Common Era, first as Christian anti-Judaism, the idea that Christianity had to grapple with the fact that Jews didn't disappear, right? Christianity was supposed to replace Jews, except we refused to go away. And so it started as a religiously based anti-Semitism. And then in the 19th century, it was transformed into something that was more racially based, which meant that for Jews, no matter how much you assimilated, and even if you converted, you could still be targeted by anti-Semitism. In fact, the assumption was that it was even more nefarious because now you were hiding. I'm wondering whether, to what extent you see these trends, either the religiously based anti-Semitism, the racially based anti-Semitism, reflected in anti-Semitism in America. So how much are we a continuation of those trends, and how much is it something that's new? Any of you can jump in and start.
I will say what is new is the fact that the person sitting in the White House, our President of the United States, has actually engaged in anti-Semitism himself, whether it's invoking anti-Semitic tropes or emboldening the white nationalists who threaten us. And we see this in rhetoric when we look at the ties between what he has said and what the perpetrators of such violence have said in their own manifestos, whether it was the killer in Pittsburgh or Poway or even in El Paso. You see references to the president's rhetoric and ideology. And never before in our history have we had a leader of our country not only engage in it, but also embolden those who are perpetrating violence. So this is deeply disconcerting to many of us, and this is a change we've never seen before. In addition, the president has failed to properly condone it. We'll all recall after Charlottesville, when he equated those neo-Nazis marching in the streets chanting, "Jews shall not replace us," with swastikas to those peacefully protesting them, that was a form of equivocating and in his own inability to really condemn neo-Nazis and white nationalists. And they saw that as a green light to continue. And we've seen a direct correlation. In fact, if you look at the statistics where he spoke in 2016 at his campaign rallies, each community saw a 226% increase in hate crimes. And Jews are the targets of half of those religiously based hate crimes. So there has definitely been a direct correlation between our leadership, those Republicans who have become silent and complicit in condemning his agenda and his rhetoric, and the anti-Semitism that we have seen exponentially increase in the past 2.5 years.
I just want to offer just a point on the statistics point. Just based on official federal data, so not a report from any non-governmental organization, official government data. Last year, we saw a 37% increase in anti-Semitism. That's a surge, 37% increase last year. Overall hate crime numbers, third consecutive year in a row where we've seen an increase in hate crimes. So looking at a period from, say, December of 2014, taking us into the presidential campaign, the election of 2016, subsequent years, we're looking at a climate that is as bad as it was post 9/11. And I think that's the context in which this conversation needs to be had.
Thanks. Peter?
I wanted to just pick up on Haley said. I think I agree with everything you said, but I also think it's important to remember that what Donald Trump does that endangers Jews is not only the things that he says about Jews. The things that he says about Muslims and Latinos also endanger Jews, right? And I think we got in Pittsburgh not only a horrifying but also a really instructive example of how anti-Semitism moves in parallel with other hatreds. That it's not a coincidence that anti-Semitism is rising, because it rises in tandem, right? So this lunatic in Pittsburgh was not what he was actually originally focused on was this idea that there was a caravan, right, of asylum seekers that were coming to invade the United States, right? That's what he was fixated on. So it started as anti-Latino bigotry that was very explicitly fueled by Donald Trump talking about an invasion. But because he was a bigot, like many other bigots throughout history, he saw Latinos as inferior. He saw black and brown people as inferior, and therefore had to reconcile the contradiction that on the one hand, they were this tremendous threat. On the other hand, if they were so inferior, how could they organize themselves to invade the United States, right? So that's where Jews came in, because the stereotype of Jews is different. The stereotype of Jews is kind of the sinister, evil genius. The Jews then become the glue that binds this story together. That's why so many people during the civil rights movement thought that Jewish communists were running the civil rights movement, because they didn't believe black people could do it themselves. Again, I mentioned South Africa. In South Africa, in the 1970s and 1980s, the South African government was always saying that Joe Slovo, right, the head of the South African Communist Party, Lithuanian immigrant, a Jew, was running the ANC. He wasn't running the ANC, but they just thought that Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu couldn't do it on their own. And so you see the way that the nature of the stereotypes, the bigotries against Jews and against people of color, essentially reinforce one another and lead us to a place where a guy who starts out being afraid of Latinos ends up shooting up a synagogue because he believes that they're the ones. What does Jews will not replace us mean, right? It doesn't actually mean Jews are going to replace us. It means Jews are going to bring in all these people of color, right? And that's why our response has to be, yes, you are right. We are going to ally with these people, right? We are going to support them, right? Because it's in our best tradition. It says 36 times in the Torah that we remember the heart of the stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. But we will also do it for self-protection, because people who understand bigotry themselves are ultimately our best allies against bigotry.
Since we're talking about white nationalism, another thing I wouldn't have thought I'd be spending so much time talking about a few years ago, but the person who actually has been talking about this for a long time is Eric Ward, sitting right next to us, who's really one of the experts on white nationalism and has been working on fighting it for a long time. So I'm wondering, Eric, we're seeing this global trend of white nationalism, and something that's new, at least in the modern era, is that these extremists can now find each other online across global boundaries. So we see these conspiracy theories building up and bouncing off of each other. We see that there's lookalike manifestos and videos that the person who wrote the manifesto in New Zealand, it sounds the language is just like the person who carried out a deadly shooting in Halle, Germany, and Poway and Pittsburgh. So that's very scary that now people who might have just been hiding out in their mom's basement playing video games and not being able to find other people like them can now find those people and build those conspiracy theories. So I'm wondering whether you can tell us some concrete strategies to fight white nationalism, either online or offline.
Yeah, I think there are some concrete things that we can do, and I'll talk about 3 of them. I think it's important to understand, though, that in the same way white supremacy in America is driven on the paper of racism, white nationalism is driven on the paper of anti-Semitism. And it's hard to understand this because the way we have built social movements in America, or what I like to say, the only way we have been allowed to build social change movements in America has been on the basis of identity, right? And so we tend to approach these issues in an understanding of it impacts me. What's different about anti-Semitism, right, though I would argue every form of bigotry actually impacts all of us, is that anti-Semitism isn't merely an attack on the Jewish community. It is also created and formulated, right, to attack democracy. So what do I mean by that? When we talk about anti-Semitism, a specific form of anti-Jewish bigotry, right, that was created in the 20th century, its role wasn't just to marginalize the Jewish community more, but to tap into societal anti-Semitism to attack democracy, right? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? This forged document was used, oh, this is interesting, by Russian secret intelligence, right, to undermine democracy in France, right? And, right, we all know this, right? When it was brought here to the US and republished by Henry Ford, right, under the International Jew through his Dearborn independent newspaper, the purpose was to undermine American democratic practice. And so if we don't understand that white nationalism is driven by anti-Semitism, and that the goal is to overturn democracy, there's actually not much we can do. So let me talk to the folks who believe, while democratic practice, I can tell you as an African American, is not perfect, right? I'm here to say up on the stage, we have a long way to go. And I want to recognize that it is the best protector of the rights that have been gained in this country since the 1960s. That many black people shed their lives and their blood to create the strongest democratic practice that this country has ever had. And the white nationalist movement is a reaction to the strengthening of democracy. It targets Jews because the narrative of the protocols of the elders of Zion is incredibly powerful, right? And the Jewish community is a small community that society has many stereotypes. So here's the three things, because I'm not going to talk all day. The first is, we need to continue these really hard conversations on anti-Semitism. And we're going to yell, and we're going to scream at each other, and we're going to disagree, and we're probably, sounds like we're going to call each other anti-Semitic, why we're having this conversation on anti-Semitism, right? But we need to have this conversation, and we have to understand this conversation is new. This country has really only been having this scale of conversation on anti-Semitism for the last 2 years, right? We don't have the right language. We need to be a little kinder. People fighting, right? We're like in a family having a fight right now, right? Inside of our house. The second, though, is we need to understand that while we're having this fight, someone is trying to burn down our house, right? And we need to keep it in perspective. The fights that are happening inside of our house are not at the scale of the people who are trying to burn down the house. Over 100, and I promise I'm getting, so this is 2, right? Over 100 Americans have been murdered by white nationalists over the last 2 years, right? Tree of Life, Poway, El Paso, Gilroy, right? Those haven't all targeted the Jewish community, right? But what I'm saying is that violence driven by the white nationalist movement is driven by anti-Semitism, right? It is the fuel that drives their existential understanding of this so-called war. Where are our elected officials? We need them to be more public, and we need them to be more voiceful. It is not enough. And so what we can do in the second thing, besides having the conversation on anti-Semitism, is making sure public officials are clear about where they stand in terms of white nationalism. 3, I'm going to quote Wade Henderson, former head of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. If you want a friend, you have to be a friend, right? The truth is white nationalism isn't winning because they are better organizers. They are winning because we continue to allow ourselves to be divided. We have allowed Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, you name it, to divide folks who believe in democratic practice, right? If we are serious, we need to advocate on another issue as much as we advocate on the issue that impacts us. So if you're advocating hard on anti-Semitism, you need to find another community who you advocate with just as hard. And that's how we begin to make the difference.
Thank you. Next few questions, maybe I'll just have a couple people answer each one so we can move through a few different topics. So we're seeing now anti-Semitism is emerging in a number of different ways and a number of different places and forums. So we've talked a lot about the white nationalist anti-Semitism that sees Jews as puppeteers who are trying to destroy America, which, as Peter said, we in fact are. or not destroy it. We're making it better, but we are doing what they think we're doing, which we think is good. And obviously, that's led to a lot of, as Eric just said, to the deaths of more than 100 people. And we're also seeing separately physical attacks on Haredim in the streets of Brooklyn and Queens. And we're seeing also moments where anger at Israel does cross the line into attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions, though likely not, or definitely not as often as many in the Jewish community thinks it does. But in the US, that form of anti-Semitism hasn't taken a deadly form since probably 2006 in the shooting at the Seattle JCC, but we know that in Europe there have been grisly murders by people who thought that they were just complaining about Israel. And so I'm wondering, with these different forms of anti-Semitism that seem very disparate, are there any common threads? Are they totally separate? Or is there something that links them together? So maybe we'll take whichever two of you want to take that one.
I'll start. I think the common thread here is that all forms of anti-Semitism should be condemned. However, I think that too often in our public narrative, we hear this false equivalence between so-called anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right. And we shouldn't fall into the trap of equating these things. These are two distinct phenomena, and one has been responsible for the deaths, as Eric said, of hundreds of people, including at our places of worship. And if you look even at the ADL's own statistics, last year, 2018, 100% of the murders related to extremists were right-wing extremists. And on the other hand, you have a range of voices with regard to Israel, some of which have crossed the line and we've deemed as anti-Semitic and condemned. But we shouldn't fall into the trap of false equivalence. Jill, you and I spoke right before the midterm elections a little over a year ago, and we were pointing out the issue of the rise of white nationalism. And many on the panel were focused on very few voices on the left with regard to Israel, and wanted to focus almost the whole conversation on those issues. And just days later, we saw what occurred 1 year ago today in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue. These issues should not be equated. So that is my warning, is to not fall into the trap of false equivalence.
One, Peter.
In that regard, I actually wanted to recommend a piece that Jill wrote in 2018 in the Washington Post about how to distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. It was, I think, in my mind, just about the best thing that's been written on the subject. And I learned a lot from it, as I have from a lot of the things that Jill has written and said. To talk about the anti-Semitism of the left, you have to understand that we do not have a consensus definition of anti-Semitism in the American Jewish community. You can't have an honest conversation about anti-Semitism on the left without having a conversation about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. If you believe that anti-Zionism, with the opposition to a state that has special privileges and special protections for Jews, if you believe that's anti-Semitism per se, as the American Jewish establishment generally tends to, you're going to see a ton of anti-Semitism on the left, because there is a fair amount of anti-Zionism on the American left. Not as much as on the European left, but a significant amount on the left. If you don't believe anti-Zionism is per se anti-Semitism, you will see much less. And I think it's very important, that's why I think it's very important to engage this argument. And I will say, I believe very strongly that anti-Zionism is not per se anti-Semitism. That's not to say that there are not anti-Zionists who are anti-Semites. Of course there are, right? But the vast, vast majority of Palestinians are anti-Zionists, just like the vast majority of Jews are Zionists. We are Zionists because it is a fairly natural response to our experience, the experience of genocidal anti-Semitism, and the sense that, thank goodness, we have a state that's protecting us. The Palestinian experience with Zionism has been a very bitter, traumatic, painful experience. You do not have to be an anti-Semite to have experienced the Palestinian experience, or be in solidarity with the Palestinian experience and not support the idea of a Jewish state that offers protections and privileges for Jews that it does not provide for Palestinians. And to my mind, any definition of anti-Semitism that dehumanizes and silences Palestinians is not a response to bigotry, it is an expression of bigotry. I myself still support the idea of a democratic Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state, but I understand that there are people who want to support one kind of secular binational state, and although I disagree with those people, I think it is, if we call those people per se anti-Semites, what we are essentially doing is becoming complicit in an American Jewish establishment effort to basically not allow Palestinians to participate in American politics. One of the things that makes me really proud of J Street is that J Street, in putting together a panel like this, would put an Arab American leader on that panel. How many other American Jewish organizations in a conversation about anti-Semitism would ever allow Palestinian or Arab Americans to speak for themselves about what they think anti-Semitism is? The last thing I'll say is, while I think it's important for us to say that anti-Zionism is not per se anti-Semitism, and therefore that anti-Zionists deserve to be part of the conversation unless there's other evidence that they have a particular hostility to Jews. I also think it's important to say that Zionism is not per se bigotry, and that Zionists should also be allowed to be in the conversation. And when we see leftist spaces creating environments where if you are a Zionist, you are not allowed to speak and not allowed to participate, then that is equally as bad.
Thank you. So Haley, I'm going to send this next question to the two of you. So Haley and Peter both raised the question of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, the ways in which anti-Semitism has become politicized. And we've seen this very much in attacks on a small number of voices on the left, very often women of color. So we know Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and AOC. So we've seen these attacks, and we've seen a lot of hypocrisy. So you have Trump attacking the Squad for being anti-Semitic, even while he's calling most of us disloyal. And, and we have also Republican members of Congress who are attacking them as being anti-Semitic, even though a member of their own party read from Mein Kampf on the House floor, which is, you can't make this stuff up, right? And so we're seeing that there are a lot of people who are broadly on the right who are attacking those on the left, again, very often women of color, even while they're ignoring the growth of white nationalism, which we've talked about. And on the left, I would say that there's a debate about how to respond to places in which there is anti-Semitism on the left, because there's one camp, perhaps it would say, well, if we call out anti-Semitism when we see it on the left, then we're just adding fuel to that fire of the people on the right, and we're helping to distract from those who are actually coming in and shooting up our synagogues. And there's others who say, well, we have to call it out on the left because it's also anti-Semitism when it's on the left, and we have to fight it wherever it pops up. So I'm wondering where, I'll throw this at the two of you, Maya and Eric, where you fall down on this question, whether there's ways to call out anti-Semitism when it shows up on the left without adding to its weaponization.
So I would start by saying that that's not even a question for me. If there's anti-Semitism and it comes from the left or it comes from the right, then you need to call it out. It's really quite simple. I don't at all see a conflict in that. But it's the reason why I tend to be so focused on coming to a real definition of anti-Semitism. Maybe that's the way to characterize it. And I think I appreciate Peter's comments and thought what he said, right? But the reality is the definition of anti-Semitism that was developed for use overseas, that has been adopted by some here in the United States, that is attempting to find advocates that now are actually at the Department of Education that are attempting to use that definition on our college campuses. That is not an acceptable definition of anti-Semitism. And as a result, we're entering in this sort of gray space, right? Again, FBI Director Wray, at a congressional hearing recently, when asked about what we were facing in this country at this time, had to confirm what we've all known, what Eric has been telling us for a long time: the single largest threat to our public safety is, in terms of violence, is coming from white supremacist violence, folks who acts that now meet the legal definition of domestic terrorism. That is what's happening in this country. So at the time that that's happening, we're trying to decide how much I can criticize the state of Israel before I get labeled a certain thing. I think that's crazy. I really, really do. I don't mean to be glib about it, but that's my issue. So if you see it on the left, you call it out. It's anti-Semitic, it's wrong. If you see it on the right, you do the same thing. But we cannot allow, at a time that our country is seeing this kind of surge in hate, this desire to defend either Bibi Netanyahu or the state of Israel or occupation or settlements, whatever it is, to conflate to the point of causing detriment to our society. And, I'm sorry, and to my community, very specifically. I regularly hear from kids on college campuses who organize on this issue because it's an important human right. Palestinian human rights is a defining issue for our community. I can't wake up tomorrow and not be Arab American. I also can't wake up tomorrow and not advocate on this issue. That's who I am. So if that issue, it becomes an issue for me in terms of where I land on the spectrum of hatred, I'm going to be really uncomfortable.
And I want to reinforce, I think, something Maya said, right? So in this work at Western State Center, right, we have not adopted any one definition of anti-Semitism out there, and certainly not the one that has risen within the Department of Education and overseas. And one of the reasons is that one of the original creators of that definition, right, Ken Stern, who actually has a book coming out soon that I think is worthwhile in reading, he actually disagrees with what happened to that definition. And I think there needs to be, we should be hesitant to close the door so quickly on the debate around anti-Semitism. And the reason why is too often we look at anti-Semitism through a historic lens rather than a present-day lens. So imagine that we only judge whether racism in American society is problematic, right, or measures up to concern through the lens of 1860 America or 1920s America, right? Like all forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism evolves and transforms, right, to meet the modern context. What I worry about in terms of the conversation around the weaponization of anti-Semitism is, one, anti-Semitism has been politicized in American society, right? It is often used to stake out political positions rather than a value-based position about the type of democracy we say we want to live in, one where everyone has the right to live, love, and work free from fear and bigotry. I have critiqued anti-Semitism on the left, right? And I also acknowledge that my primary concern is white nationalism, right? And it is not a left or right issue, though folks would argue that I'm on the left until you talk to my friends on the left who say absolutely not. But it's not a left or right issue, right? It's not about conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, right? This is a debate over inclusion versus exclusion, right? And where will we ground our democracy? So, understanding that, I still understand anti-Semitism is politicized in our society. It has benefited some, right? We haven't talked about anti-Semitism enough, so we get confused by the anti-Semitism of the anti-Semites and the anti-Semitism of the philo-anti-Semitism, right? But, you know, quick thing, both are anti-Semitism, right? I often point to the fact that the Turner Diaries, authored by neo-Nazi William Pierce, right, ends the same way that Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth ends, with the nuking of Israel, right? And so we should understand that there is no good ending to the philo-Semitism tapped into by those like our president and others. The last thing I would just say about the weaponization of anti-Semitism is this. Once in Oregon, a long time ago, there was a black couple who moved into a small rural town, first black folks in that town. Someone tried, I think they burned a cross, or they tried to burn down their house. So we went out there to meet with the couple and folks in the community to help them organize. And one of the persons we were meeting with said to us, you know, it's strange. There was no racism in our community till the couple moved here, right? Now, we know better, right? We know as organizers and as leaders, people don't try to tap into things that don't exist, right? So this third piece is, yes, anti-Semitism exists in the left, and the more we ignore it, the more likely we are to stumble across it. Why does it exist in the left? Because it just exists in American society, right? And yes, it will be used against us as wedges. But if we don't want people to be shooting us with the wedge strategy, right, we have to stop giving them the ammunition, right? And that means within the left, we have to, one, take anti-Semitism as seriously as we take other forms of bigotry. Two, we have to stop personalizing it, worrying about who the anti-Semite is, and just have conversations around what happens when we accidentally engage in anti-Semitism. My friend Maya, I'll tell this story, called me out privately once because I was dabbling in something that I think was Islamophobic, and what I was doing was, in conversation, I had totally conflated, right, Arab Americans as all Muslim, and she pointed it out to me, right? You know what I said? Thank you, right? And so in the second piece, what I'm saying is we need to be kinder to one another inside the house. The third is just this. We can't pretend, right, that we don't target people of color when they make mistakes, right? We just can't do it, right? This is a whole society that does nothing but target people of color when they make mistakes. And so we have to be aware that our natural instinct, right, is to go rabid, right, on other vulnerable people, right? And we should think about that the next time an issue of anti-Semitism comes up on the left. It doesn't mean we don't hold it accountable, but we have to nuance all the dynamics at play.
Okay. So, last question before we go to Q&A, and I'll ask you to each take just like 30 seconds or so to answer. Sometime in the last few years, I went back and reread Leonard Dinerstein Alava Shalom's really influential 1994 book, Anti-Semitism in America, which after I read it 20 years ago, I think I stashed it in a high shelf thinking I would never need it again, but here we are. And I noticed that he ends the book close to the end of the conclusion. He says, "There's no reason to suspect that anti-Semitism will not continue to decline in the United States, even though there will always be sporadic outbursts and temporary flare-ups. The nation is too strongly committed to cultural pluralism for long-term trends toward greater tolerance and acceptance of diversity in the United States to reverse themselves sharply. The obvious conclusion is that anti-Semitism has declined in potency and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future." So you wrote this in 1994, and I want to know, did he speak too soon, or are we just in a flare-up and he was actually right?
A little bit.
Sadly, on the one hand, he spoke too soon, but on the other hand, how could we have foreseen what has fundamentally been a shift in terms of this paradigm we're all facing? And I agree with Eric that we can't view it through the lens of anti-Semitism in the past, or even through the lens by which he was viewing it in 1994. We are facing a fundamentally different era, And, you know, and as much as we shouldn't politicize it, and we condemn those who do, it is also important to recognize that our political leaders do play a role here, and it's not just the president. Jill, you referenced Mo Brooks, the member of Congress who read from Mein Kampf on the House floor and called all Democrats Nazis. But how many of you heard about that? Right, because there is a narrative out there, and much of this is perpetuated by Republicans from the president on down, to be silent when it occurs on their side of the aisle. There have been many incidents like this, and the only one where Republicans have condemned, and they get credit for it, it was Steve King. However, he was aligned with white supremacy and in that position for 16 years before they said anything. There have been numerous examples of this in the past year, and we, the Jewish Democratic Council of America, have tracked them on our website, jewishdems.org. There's an interactive timeline that sadly we have to update almost every day of the rise of anti-Semitism on the right, but also I completely agree we must condemn it wherever it may emerge, but I call on my Republican colleagues and our elected officials to do the same and to recognize it on their side of the aisle, including in the White House.
Thank you. Again, just 30 seconds because I want to get to questions.
Look, I think Dinnerstein was wrong. Anti-Semitism is rising because America is in the midst of a massive battle about whether we can actually be a multiracial democracy. America was founded on two competing principles, one of which was liberal democracy, the other was white supremacy. And as people of color have grown in number and gained the possibility of real political power, we see those two forces struggling against one another epically, and in that struggle, the people who are forces of white supremacy bring anti-Semitism in their effort to defeat democracy, as we've heard said before. But I just want to end by saying I also think it's important to remember that there are amazing, amazing things going on in pursuit of multiracial democracy, which envision coalitions that would have been really hard to imagine before. I mean, I just happened to see on social media a couple of weeks ago something that almost brought me to tears, which was that when Bernie Sanders had his heart attack, evidently a group of Muslim Americans, and I don't know, maybe this is a Muslim tradition, decided that they were going to start reading sections of the Quran as a kind of vigil and keep reading them until they saw that he was back to health. Again, maybe there is some religious significance to this, but that, I mean, who could have, again, whether you want Bernie Sanders to be president or not, that's not the point. Who could have imagined, right? A guy whose family was wiped out in the Holocaust, right? The parent of Yiddish-speaking Jews coming to the United States. Now a Muslim campaign manager, almost certainly the candidate with the most Muslim support in the United States, right? Even though he supports a two-state solution and a democratic Jewish state, right? Because his vision of America as an equal, multiracial democracy is so compelling that it shatters these divides between Jews and Muslims and other groups that our leaders often are trying to erect.
So it's an Excel table, and you divide the surahs, and each person gets assigned a name, and then you run through the whole thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I have to say, it's now an Excel table. It wasn't always an Excel table. The thing is, that doesn't surprise me in the slightest, Peter. And I think that's one of the things that I struggle with, and the reason that sometimes Eric and I have had conversations, as he pointed out, that are difficult about conflating the Arabs and Muslims. The crux of this issue is not about interfaith work between Muslims and Jews. It's specifically about the problems that originate from the occupation, and Arab land is, I mean, I'll just put it out there, and people, so there is this conflict that comes out as a result of that as opposed to this. So I love interfaith dialogue. I'm down with people communicating on all those issues. I just struggle when it gets reduced to that, because then the anti-Arab bigotry doesn't enter into the conversation, and the ability to have the conversation about occupation becomes the problem. So I would argue that, and I say this as both an Arab American and as a Muslim, I think my First Amendment religious liberty will be equally protected. I'm not sure that my kid's rights to wear my son wearing his Palestine t-shirt to school, getting called an anti-Semite in the hallway every time he wore it, is going to go away when we finish the, getting to that understanding. So that's the point I want to make. And then the second, if I may, just on your point, Eric, there is no question that people of color, women of color, add the hijab and you've got like bonus, right? There's no question that that's who's going to be targeted. But I think it's important to reflect on the two Muslim members of Congress who served prior to Ilhan and Congresswoman Tlaib's election, right? We had Andre Carson and Keith Ellison in Congress, and there was not an issue of them being accused of anti-Semitism until Keith ran for the DNC, to be clear. So he could serve, but when he ran for the DNC, some things surfaced. And what's the difference that Congressman Tlaib and Congressman Omar? It's about the fact that they've endorsed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Because of their support for BDS, we've decided that puts them in play for these charges. And that makes me, we can hijack the whole conversation in this room, so I don't want to do that, but that makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And I think, I joke with Jeremy that when he brings me in to have these conversations, I always say, why do you invite me back? Because I tend to be very direct about these issues. I think that J Street plays an incredible role in Washington in terms of advocating for human rights. And I think one of the biggest mistakes J Street has made, and I'm going to be fully put it out there on there, is the position that it's taken on BDS. Because if you equate the entire movement with anti-Semitism, then the logical conclusion is Rashida's an anti-Semite. And that is a problem we should all be very concerned about.
Okay. Eric, do you want to add? Okay. All right. So lots of things have been raised. We're going to open it up to questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please line up at the mic over here. I would ask you, we want to get questions from a diversity of ages, genders. So please, I'm going to ask you, if you notice that a lot of people near you at the mic look like you, try to rearrange yourself so that that's not true. And I also, just as a reminder, this is being live streamed. So just so you know. So Victor, go ahead.
Jill, Victor Covener, board member from New York. I'd like to ask an easy question about whether white nationalism is rising within the Jewish community. And my question is, A, is it true that because of policies about Israel, that white nationalism is rising within particularly the ultra-observant community? Is that true? And is that also true? Is it rising in the Israeli settler movement?
I'm going to suggest we take 3 questions, if that's okay with all of you, and then you can each answer whichever one of them you want. So that's the first question. Can you just say your name also?
Hi, Adam Chekhov. I'm from Arlington. Quick question. I know this may be somewhat esoteric, but if at all possible, can anyone, are there any takeaways we in the United States or any takeaways that we in the United States can take from what's going on with Corbyn's Labor Party, with I know a lot of progressive Jews sort of feel caught in the middle between a right-leaning Jewish establishment that will consider sort of any criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitic, and some I would say a small minority of activists on the left who just would defend sort of any who would essentially traffic in some anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So if I know that's esoteric, but if anyone can speak to that.
Jessica, I'm going to jump you next.
Thank you. Hi, Jessica Brown from New York. I'm wondering if part of the problem is that no one really understands today, as opposed to however many years ago, about what is exactly Zionism and what is anti-Zionism. And in particular, clearly Bernie Sanders lived his whole life as a Zionist when it was a socialist state, it was progressive. And I think that most young people today have only really known a Zionism that's typified by Netanyahu and the farther right settlers. And I think, the whole idea that it might be racism to me is crazy, but when they see the current leadership, I think it's more understandable why one might think that. And I guess the question is, how can we, try to make it clear that Zionism is what it is and not what some people currently in power in Israel would like us to believe? And then I guess the same thing goes with anti-Zionism, because people say, well, anti-Zionism means you literally want to kill everyone in Israel and push them into the sea, which probably was a popular attitude 40 years ago. But I think now they're clearly anti-Zionists who may believe in one state, but they don't want to actually kill all the Jews there. And that's a problem.
Okay, so we have white nationalism within the Jewish community. We have a question about England, and then Zionism, anti-Zionism. So any of you can answer one or three of those.
Wow. Okay, so quickly on white nationalism within the Jewish community. You know, if you look at the broader alt-right coalition, right, that's been formed by the white nationalist movement, you certainly will see Jews in there, but you will also see African Americans and Latinos and Asians. That is about the shifting demographics of the United States. It also has to do, right, with Israeli policies, right? It has to do with what people see as conservative values, right? What I will say, though, is it unique? We should not see it as unique. We are in a time where globally the trend is towards authoritarianism, right, and totalitarianism. That's not just within the white nationalist movement. The second piece is, look, I have to remind people constantly, there are blacks who fought on the side of the Confederacy, right? There were Jews in Europe who supported fascism, right? Not the National Socialist Party, but fascism. These are not new phenomena in history, and we need to keep it in context, similarly how we need to keep context around anti-Semitism on the left, speaking of momentum and the Labor Party. Look, what my take is, right, this is just my take, and you all can give me a hard time afterwards. I think that there are leaders within the Labor Party who are trying to get a handle on anti-Semitism, right? And there are, I think the question the Jewish community has to ask itself in the UK is, what is the current purpose of the attacks on the Labour Party? Is it, right, ultimately to get rid of Corbyn? Because if that's the case, that is one set of tactics. Or is it to create a strong, resilient Labour Party that opposes anti-Semitism and to make a better leader out of Corbyn? And I ask that because the sets of tactics one would use for each of those looks different. And it's not clear to me that the goal is not to get rid of Corbyn. That is a different type of existential fight.
But let me just pick up on that. I think that's a really, really important point to make. I mean, the point that Jill made in that terrific Washington Post piece was, it's very, very important. And I say this as someone who believes very strongly and spoke at a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, making the argument that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. But it's important that anti-Zionists be very clear that Zionist is not a synonym for Jew, right? And also be very clear that if you want to tell me that you believe in one state with rights for all people, I will say, fine, let's have a conversation. I do not consider you an anti-Semite. But it's very important that as part of that conversation, you say explicitly that you believe that Jews have the right to live with safety and dignity in the land between the river and the sea. And if you can't bring yourself to say that, then we have a problem. I think that a great deal of effort in the organized American Jewish community has been made, I think, over a bunch of years to prevent Palestinians and their political allies, who disproportionately come from the Muslim and Arab communities, from being able to exercise their political voice in the face of demographic, those communities are rising demographically. And in the effort to try to prevent them from being able to be politically articulate and actually represent their point of view, you see tragically, a lot of making common cause with bigots. Because after all, if you're afraid, one answer to preventing Palestinians from having a voice politically and Muslims from having a voice is simply not to let them in, or basically delegitimize them so much that it becomes impossible for them to run for office without being under constant attack. And the American organized Jewish community, especially the right wing of the American Jewish community, is deeply, deeply implicated in that white nationalist effort. Just look at look at where people like Frank Gaffney get a lot of their funds, right? And this is, I think, and it's tragic because I think partly it's a terrible misunderstanding of where Jewish values and Jewish self-interests lie. But it's not. But as Eric has said, I don't know how many of you in this room know who Percy Uttar was, right? Percy Uttar was the head of the largest Orthodox synagogue in Johannesburg at the time when he prosecuted Nelson Mandela in the Rivonia trial that sent Mandela to prison, right? For decades, right? There have always been Jews who have felt that we should align up, that if we get some element of acceptance from the powers that be, we should align with them and make a separate peace and against people of color. And that is unfortunately also a Jewish tradition, and we have to call it out. From Breitbart to Ben Shapiro to Mort Klein, there are a whole series of people in our community who have been guilty of the most crude and blatant anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian bigotry, and that we don't even really think in terms of anti-Palestinian bigotry is part of the core problem, right? That we don't even think that supporting the denial of millions of people basic rights for half a century could constitute bigotry shows how underdeveloped the conversation even is in our community.
Thank you. So you two will get the next round, and probably you can say some of the same things that you were going to say. Okay, so I'm going to take the first two people in line, and then if there's a J Street U student somewhere online, can you please just bump yourself to number 3 online? Just walk up and take that spot. Thank you. Just trying to mix it up a little bit. Okay, so, sir, go ahead.
My
Say
name
your
is
name.
Larry Gelman. I live in Tucson, Arizona. And I have heard and obviously been very attentive to the rise in violent acts against Jews and murders and the expressions of violence and hatred. And yet, I can also remember a time when Jews were changing their names to sound less Jewish and getting nose jobs to look less Jewish, and where Jews couldn't marry whoever they wanted and couldn't live wherever they wanted and couldn't go to school wherever they wanted and couldn't work wherever they wanted and couldn't play golf wherever they wanted. And none of those are issues today. So I would throw out the notion and ask for comments that perhaps in terms of the broadest sense of issues that affect the lives of most Jews, that this is actually the best of times for Jews in the history of the world. But we have this politically, racially, hate-motivated phenomenon going on that's very violent, very over the top, not like anything we've ever seen before, but we're allowing ourselves to use the narrative that things are worse than they've ever been, when in fact, I think a case could be made for the fact that they're better than they've ever been.
Okay, so are things worse or better? Next, please. Thank you.
I have no idea. I want to follow on some of the comments that were just made. It seems to me there's less concern in Israel about what is happening in the U.S. on the issue we care about, anti-Semitism. They don't use their support in the Congress, for example, with the Republicans, to make this an important issue. So the FBI would focus on it, so there'd be money for it. And I really wondered why. Is it because of the evangelical connection? Is it because other issues are more important to Israel? And I'm sure they are more important, but okay, this is an important issue to us. And the other thing I'm wondering about is why
Let's just leave it to one. So let's just leave it to that.
Well,
why?
let me just ask,
Okay.
if there's a foreign policy component, why we don't care when Netanyahu meets anti-Semites from Ukraine, Viktor Orban from Hungary, and why we aren't more vocal of that. Is there any way the U.S. and Israeli communities can work together on issues that frankly matter a lot more to my kids, which is anti-Semitism in the United States than settlements in the West Bank?
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Blake. I go to George Washington University. As all of us in here probably know, many college campuses across this country have progressive organizations or organizations that fall under a progressive label that openly call Zionism a form of racism, imperialism, colonialism, and things of that nature. Zionists, even two-state solution, peace-seeking Zionists like myself, are often blackballed from these circles, even those who are strong advocates for progressive issues like a Green New Deal or Medicare for All. For Jewish Zionists who also see themselves as progressives, confronting this sentiment is really hard, because the last thing we want to do is be seen as moderate or even right-wing, which is a reality. How do we argue effectively that progressivism and Zionism can coexist without coming across as condescending? How can we educate and make our voices heard and stand in solidarity with those who really don't want to hear our voices?
Thank you. So, Maya and Haley, you can take any or all of those.
So I'll start by saying it's a bit about the point that Peter closed with, right? That if we start, when it comes to this issue, that can you really be a progressive if you don't advocate for the end of the occupation, for example? I don't think so. So the question is being very careful in the words that we use. So for example, I'll just put out, I don't use the term Zionism is racism because I don't think it's constructive. I think it shuts down conversations. On the most basic definition of Zionism is Jews have a right to a homeland, then I would say, okay, that is a definition that would work for me. The political Zionism, though, which is that Jews have a right to a Jewish state based on the Jewish state law that was passed in 2018, then you lose me there. So those are distinctions I try to draw. Those are difficult conversations to be had on college campuses, but I think that be open to having those conversations and what it means, because it is, our kids are allowed to engage on certain issues, but on this one it gets shut down. So that's the reason that I think you see the tension. So we'll choose our words carefully. We're going to be careful about how we talk about it, but we have to be open to understanding that I never used to call Israel an apartheid state either. I don't know how you can not refer to it that way after the nation-state law's passage. So we just have to be honest and fair about where the conversation lands. And then just one minor point to the point that Peter was talking about. My organization was established in 1985 specifically to deal with the political exclusion of my community. Our president, James Zogby, and Helen Samham published a paper called The Politics of Exclusion. It was about us being able to participate in the democratic process until we were active on this issue. Our campaign contributions were returned. It was called Arab money. It wasn't Arab American, it was just Arab money. We were fake creation of the petrodollar. Stephen Emerson wrote that book then. They're still engaged on that stuff now. So I think it's important that the dossiers on Jim, maybe not dossier, but the paragraphs that were written about why our president was a problem came from the legacy Jewish organizations. It was AJC and ADL that published those papers. I still have them. So I think those are the difficult conversations that have to take place in order for us to be able to get to a better place about the conversation the young man is raising. I want you to be able to engage on these issues the way that you want without the problems taking place. It just means we have to kind of, rip off the Band-Aid and talk about what's actually been happening on this issue for some time.
I would say that the overwhelming majority of Jews are both progressive and Zionist. And we have to, of course, not box ourselves into what those definitions mean. For example, the Jewish Electorate Institute did polling last year and again this year, where they asked Jewish voters if they consider themselves, without defining it, pro-Israel. And an overwhelming number said yes, over 90%. But then asked, do you support all of the current Israeli government policies? 59% were critical of at least some of the current Israeli government policies. This is the majority of us Jewish voters who consider ourselves to also be pro-Israel, demonstrating that, yes, we can be both pro-Israel and be critical of the current Israeli government, just as I am a proud American and a patriot who is highly critical, as you have heard for the past hour, of our current American government and our president. We have to have space. We have to create space to have these conversations. So my advice to the student who is here is to listen, is to bring those voices to the table, and to proudly defend yourself as a progressive, as a Zionist. Explain what that means to you, but don't tell others what it should mean to them. In terms of why I think someone had said why we don't care that Netanyahu meets with Orban. Well, I care. I'll tell you what I believe. I think that this demonstrates, even more troubling perhaps, or equally as troubling, is our own president meets with Orban and doesn't mention the rise of anti-Semitism in Hungary. Deeply troubling. This is something that we're seeing. It's not just in Israel. It's here in Washington as well. And it is troubling, and you have to question what are the priorities then? What are the priorities? Clearly, in the case of our president, it is not fighting anti-Semitism in where we've seen it emerge elsewhere throughout the world. And he's met with many world leaders who have engaged in anti-Semitism and has never mentioned it. I think this question about are we in the best of times, are we in the worst of times, because we can, I think the example you gave is play golf where we'd like. I respectfully disagree with the sense that somehow we are now better off because we do have, not the same form of discrimination we have faced in the past. But if we for 1 minute thinks that that means that our synagogue or our community or our schools will not be next in terms of this rise of white nationalism, then we're kidding ourselves. Because it is not, yes, it's a different paradigm we face. Perhaps it's even a different form of anti-Semitism than in the past, where it was just discrimination. This is different in terms of the rise of white nationalism, and it is very dangerous, and it doesn't affect just our community. So if we think for 1 minute somehow we are inoculated from it because we don't face the kind of discrimination we may have faced in the past, then we're really kidding ourselves.
I think we're just going to take a speed round. We'll just take the next two people, really just try to keep it to a one-sentence question. Sorry, you all can come up and ask questions afterwards, and we'll take very quick responses.
Okay. I'm Ronnie Cook-Zulke. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I live 2 blocks from Tree of Life. I hope somebody will comment on whether or not lumping the 4 freshman representatives as the squad is something that makes you uncomfortable, and whether or not you feel that that's part of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And could somebody please just explain the role of HIAS and why Tree of Life? Because I think everybody in this room needs to leave with that understanding and hear it from 1 or 2 of our panelists. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Zachary Fetterman. I'm a freshman at Brown University. I don't want to have this discussion without talking about something that often goes unaddressed, which is the unique issues and experiences of Jews of color who experience racism in and outside of the Jewish community, anti-Semitism in and outside of their communities of color, and are really in a unique position to understand personally the relationship between white nationalism and anti-Semitism. So my question is, how do we center within our communities, within our activism, and within this discussion, the experiences of those who are most marginalized?
Thank you. And again, very quick, Logan is waving the 1 minute sign at me, so.
I want to ask you about one more aspect of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, maybe particularly for Maya and Peter. Peter has personal experience with it, and Maya probably does too. There are sites, internet sites, masking as anti-hate sites, which are hate sites, like David Horowitz's and Canary Mission, which profile people. People who are profiled cannot respond. I know people who have received death threats because they have been profiled. I know people who have not been able to re-enter Israel and the Palestinian territories because they have been profiled. My particular question is, what can be done to maybe take them down or push back against them? Because once the profiles are up, the damage begins. And thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, so we're really ending. I'm going to ask Peter, you referred to, I think you kind of said in passing the answer to the question about HIAS, but maybe you could just say one sentence, and then maybe one other of you will take a stab at one of the other questions, and then if, I don't know how much everybody can hang out, but I think there'll be an opportunity to at least grab some people on the way out. That's okay.
So HIAS is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They were been supportive of the rights of immigrants in the United States, and therefore were targeted as somehow being behind this caravan. And it was because the Pittsburgh Synagogue was doing a program with them that this guy went after them. One sentence I just want to say on what you can do about groups like Canary Mission, which is that when you experience not just anti-black, not just anti-Latino, but also anti-Palestinian bigotry at Kiddush, at shul, around the Seder table, around the Shabbat table, anywhere, you must be as vigilant in fighting it as you would want Palestinians or Muslims or Arabs to be in fighting anti-Semitism if they experience it.
And I would suggest that, if I can, just the answer to the student who asked about centering Jews of color, yes. I mean, your question was the answer. It's a challenge, internal challenge to our community, and we have to keep working on it. So I want to...
Regarding the squad, just
Yeah.
quickly, the only thing that these 4 women have in common is they are all 4 women of color who the president has repeatedly berated. So I think we should refrain ourselves from grouping them all together, and whether you agree with them individually or not, no one is deserving of what he has thrown their way, which are racial slurs such as "go back to where you came from." He should not obviously be engaging in that form of that form of racism. So let us not repeat it by grouping them all together. They are 4 members of Congress. They have 4 different views, and we shouldn't generalize about any groups of people.
One last second.
Maya, last word.
If you're not familiar with the Canary Project, please take a moment and look it up. When the weaponization of anti-Semitism is often employed, it's based on information that's from that site, and they've done a really good job of moving from targeting pro-Palestinian advocacy to now including regular white nationalist groups, so it's a little more difficult to discern their objective, but please do look at that and examine it carefully in terms of when the charges are brought forward against people.
Thank you to all of you for being here and to everybody for being part of the conversation.